Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is November 16th. On this day in 1957, the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin became the focus of one of the most chilling and infamous criminal cases in American history. It began with the disappearance of a local hardware store owner, Bernice Worden, and by nightfall, it would lead investigators to a remote farmhouse and a discovery that would lead to the arrest of one of America's most notorious serial killers. Today, we're talking about the disappearance and murder of Bernice Worden. Let's get started. November 16th, 1957 was a typical Saturday morning in Plainfield, Wisconsin, when Bernice Worden opened up her shop, Worden's Hardware, as usual. Sometime before noon, she rang up what would be her final sale, a bottle of antifreeze. That receipt would become critical. When her son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Worden, stopped by the store later that afternoon, he found the place eerily quiet. The cash register was open, there was blood on the floor, and a .22 caliber rifle was missing from its usual place. It didn't take long for suspicion to turn to a local handyman, Ed Gein. Investigators quickly learned that Gein had been in the store the night before, and he had told Bernice that he'd be back the next morning for antifreeze. That receipt bearing his name made him the last confirmed customer, and it made him the person they needed to find next. That same evening, deputies headed out to Ed Gein's property on the outskirts of Plainfield, a rundown farmhouse surrounded by outbuildings, fields, and woods. They began searching a shed attached to the house. What they found inside would shift the case from a missing person to a brutal murder. Bernice Worden's body was discovered hanging by her heels, decapitated and mutilated. She had been, quote, dressed out like a deer, end quote, as one deputy would later describe it. She had been shot with a .22 rifle, and the mutilation happened after death. That horrific scene was only the beginning. When officers entered the main house, they found human remains unlike anything they'd ever encountered. Items fashioned from bones, skin, and skulls. He made furniture, masks, and bowls, and each item they found was more disturbing than the last. Most notoriously, they found what would later be referred to as a woman's suit, which had been stitched together from skin. That same night, Sheriff Arthur Schley and Deputy Frank Worden arrested Ed Gein. The discoveries made inside that farmhouse would go on to shock the nation and inspire fictional characters for decades. But in 1957, the horror was real, and law enforcement was dealing with this in a town that had never seen anything like it. As they worked through the home, they found something else. Remains that belonged to Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who had gone missing from a nearby town in 1954. That tied Gein to a second murder. Gein also later admitted to digging up graves at local cemeteries. That, along with the evidence found in the house, explained why there were so many remains but so few confirmed victims. However, police believed that he was responsible for more murders. But in the end, he was only formally charged with just two, Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan. As the community reeled, Ed Gein was arraigned for the murder of Bernice Worden. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Soon after, doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia, and he was declared unfit to stand trial. That ruling sent him to a state mental institution while the legal system waited to see if he might someday be deemed competent. Meanwhile, authorities continued to search Gein's property and local cemeteries, trying to match remains to known missing persons and verify his claims of grave robbing. Now, they did confirm several, though many of the remains were never conclusively identified. Plainfield, which was once a quiet farming town, had now become the center of national media attention. And the crime scene at Gein's farm would haunt the public imagination for years to come. Ed Gein remained in state custody for nearly a decade before doctors determined that he was mentally competent to stand trial. In 1968, proceedings finally began, without a jury at the request of the defense. Judge Robert Gallmar presided over the case in Wautoma, Wisconsin. During testimony, a psychiatrist reported Gein's claim that the rifle went off accidentally while he was handling it in the store. But that version of events was weighed against overwhelming physical evidence from the crime scene. On November 14, 1968, the judge found Ed Gein guilty of first-degree murder. But the trial wasn't over. Under Wisconsin law at the time, the next step was a separate sanity hearing. After considering expert testimony from both sides, Judge Gallmar ruled that Gein was not legally responsible for his actions due to insanity. Instead of prison, Gein was recommitted to a state psychiatric hospital where he would remain for the rest of his life. Although he had also been linked to Mary Hogan's death, prosecutors only pursued the Worden case. The reason was simple. A successful insanity ruling meant that he would remain confined regardless of any further charges. As public fascination with the case grew, rumors swirled that Gein's property might be turned into a macabre roadside attraction. Just days before an auction was scheduled, a mysterious fire destroyed the farmhouse. Though arson was suspected, no one was ever charged. However, Gein's car, the same one he used to haul remains, was sold to a carnival operator and displayed as a sideshow attraction. It was just another unsettling detail in an already horribly disturbing story. Ed Gein lived out the rest of his life at Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin. He died on July 26, 1984, at the age of 77. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery. His grave, like his legacy, drew unwanted attention. Over the years, it was vandalized repeatedly, and eventually his headstone was stolen. It didn't take long for the horror of what investigators found on Ed Gein's property to make its way into fiction. His case inspired some of the most memorable characters in modern horror: Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. But behind those fictional portrayals is a very real story, and a victim whose name deserves to come first. Bernice Worden was a hardware store owner, a mother, and a beloved member of her community. Her disappearance on a cold November day led to one of the most horrifying crime scenes in American history. And it was her son's persistence as a deputy sheriff that ensured that the truth came to light. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found Bernice's story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe, and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!